Hey everybody, so I'm the creative director at Giant Sparrow, and we made a game called What Remains of Edith Finch. And this was the team near the peak. We went from being 3 people in the beginning to about 15, and then back down again. But relatively small team, not too much bigger probably than a lot of your teams. And here's a quick trailer for people that haven't played the game yet, for a reminder. Do we have sound? Okay. What? It's playing here.
I think it's the volume counter on the bottom left of the screen.
Oh, right. Sorry, I'm an idiot. Yeah, this is an animation tool for keyframing, and usually I don't need audio. So, okay, thank you.
I'm sure my mind was just trying to protect me. Now that there's only one of us left, I thought it was time I heard the stories. But now I'm worried the stories themselves might be the problem. Maybe we believed so much in the family curse, we made it real. But it had to end one way or another.
Okay, so that's the game. In a nutshell, it's a collection of short stories about a cursed family in Washington State, and you play as each of the family members on the last day of their lives, and you sort of see how each of those family members die. The game is, rather than like a traditional game, which would be about challenge or fun, this game is about trying to evoke a feeling of the sublime, and looking at that through each of the individual people. And the original inspiration for the game was scuba diving. So the experience that I had growing up in Washington State and seeing like the bottom of the ocean sloping away into an infinite darkness, and the sense of something being at the same time beautiful but also a bit overwhelming. And that's kind of where we started from, and then went off in a lot of different directions, obviously. And that's kind of what this talk is about. It's about how we go from having these kind of ethereal feeling goals into like a concrete game that expresses some of those goals. So over the course of the talk, I'll sort of dip into the way that we break that out, going from the feeling to the actual game, including some specific notes on how we do our prototyping, and then how we fix the problems in prototyping through a lot of brute force playtesting in the end. And all of this is kind of about how to make something when you don't really understand what it is. A lot of game development, obviously, is very difficult, so games tend to be very similar to other games, because it's one way to mitigate risks, and we take a very different approach, and we just kind of shoot for something that feels interesting to us, but we have no idea how or if we can get there. And then the development process is just a lot of constant reevaluation and trying to figure out like what worked and then what's not working and how do we fix that. But it's a lot of like scrambling around in the dark. So that's also what the games end up feeling like, in a weird synchronicity, where the games themselves are often sort of about the process of exploration, as is what it's like to make them. So just at a high level, one of the difficulties that we start out with in trying to make a game that is about feeling is that most players are not very receptive to that as the goal, because games have taught them that that's kind of not something that they should be concerned with, where like if you're watching a movie, you don't have a lot of other things going on, so you're very keyed into the emotions of the characters and what's being said. But in a game, that's not the case. You have a lot of other things that you are being asked to deal with, often life-threatening issues like zombies running at you or whatever. And even if your game doesn't have that, it's part of the background that the players bring to your game. Like just kind of expecting that that's the way that they're going to be navigating this world. So we have to spend a bit of time convincing them that it's okay, that this is, like a different kind of experience. And one of the ways that we do that is, even though it's like, from a first-person perspective, we, don't give them a gun. Like anytime you give a player something, they will abuse it. And it's just like a sad truth that you can't let them do anything, otherwise they'll just like keep doing it. So sometimes, just like peeling back what they can do at any given time is the best way to make sure that they kind of see the things that you're hoping that they'll notice. And like our goal ultimately is to create a interesting space for players to explore and to think about. So even though when people play the game, it feels as if it's like a game about a story and that we have this kind of message that we're trying to convey to people, it's more about creating a place for them to come to and bring the things that they have in their own life, like using the momentum that they come to the game with, which is much more interesting to them and to us, frankly, than for us to just didactically be communicating our view of the universe. And in terms of just kind of breaking out the nuts and bolts of the way that we go about building these games, rather than starting with like a written story or like traditionally like a mechanic, like, oh, you'll run, here are the kind of guns you have, and here's how far you can jump and whatever. We start with a feeling. I'll get into a lot more detail on that. And then, this is just some things that I will cover in more detail later, but just a heads up, we'll be talking about contexts and prototypes and playtests and the way that one of the irresponsible things that we do from a scheduling standpoint is that we also just like keep changing things all the way to the very end. It's an exhausting process that never stops, but there's a weird power that comes from being flexible. As you move along through the development process, you have better tools for solving problems, and you also have a better sense of what you actually need to, what the problems are. Early on, you're very clueless about it, but as you run out of time, suddenly you can fix it. It's a very dramatic situation, but I think it really helps to be flexible throughout the whole process, and so that's what a lot of this talk is about how do you not be rigid, but still be specific enough that other people, like if an animator shows up at 9 in the morning and wants to start doing work, like what are they working on that's not going to get completely thrown out? Like how do other people keep moving forward when nobody really knows what it is that you're doing? And I think the strongest beginning and sort of overall theory that we've developed is that feelings are the things that are the most flexible and likely to survive over the torturous process of game development. That we try a lot of things that do not work, and a lot of our ideas, really seem very sound on the whiteboard. But as soon as people start controlling it, it's like too hard for us to make that good, or it's just a really bad idea, or whatever it is. There's a lot of things that have to change, and a lot of that can be really fun. The game evolves like a child, like in ways that you don't expect, especially when you have a team that's collaborating on it. And if you begin with something that is flexible enough to encompass that, then hopefully everything that you're doing is kind of in service of that goal. So that's why we start with the feeling rather than anything that's a little more brittle. And then as soon as we have a feeling, then the next step is to work on like what do the buttons actually do? Because as soon as you get to the point where you're giving it to the player, like that's what they want to know. Like how do I interact with this world? And it's the hardest thing to make changes to once you've made bad decisions there, and it takes the longest. And every other department kind of feeds off of what it is that the player is doing. Like the artists want to know how far away is my camera, for example. Like, and that's going to be determined by what it is that the player is doing and what kind of information they need to know. And so we get very quickly into gameplay. And then story for us actually comes at the very end. I mean, we have a story going into it. We kind of know what we think might happen, but what we found is that it's more effective to go in with the best intentions and then find gameplay that kind of suits the tonal goals, and then at the very end come back and rewrite everything to reflect what the game actually is, rather than try to make a story and then like shoehorn gameplay into that, which is so hard. We make a first attempt, best guess at like what's going to work, and then we see, oh yeah, these things actually worked out pretty well. Let's write from a different perspective, or let's really shorten this thing up to fit. Like if we have a story, like for example, Calvin's story, we're on a swing set. It turns out that's only really interesting for about like 2 or 3 minutes. So then like everything kind of shifts so that, okay, that becomes like, that's as long as that story needs to be. So starting off with the feeling, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could communicate the feeling, but what I have found is most effective is to boil it down into like 3 simple words. And ideally, these are things that you could give to like an artist or a programmer or an animator, and they would have some meaning to them. Like if an animator is doing like a jump or something, then it would be like, okay, well, what does like an intimate jump feel like? And there's a way that that might sort of make sense. Sublime, these 3 words are what we use for Edith Finch: sublime, intimate, and murky. Sublime is a little harder on jump animation, but it's something that an artist could look at like, okay, well, I'm doing this fog. Like, how do I make this scene feel a little bit more sublime? And I think when you work in these, I mean, they're specific feelings, but they're not necessarily prescriptive. It gives everybody else on the team the sort of flexibility to say, oh, well, I think that actually, like the artist might, look at that in terms of how the lighting works, or whatever it is. It's specific enough for people to know where to start, but it also gives them room to add something that you might not have been able to suggest. So once you have your kind of couple of feeling goals, then I found that it's also really helpful to try to surround yourself with that as a tool for kind of exploring that in your own head. It's almost like you're playing this game before anybody else is, years before, and you kind of like simulating what these feelings are like and steeping yourself in it. On the case of Edith Finch, we found that there's this genre called weird fiction that Neil Gaiman is a part of, H.P. Lovecraft. There's a bunch of people that have written stories that evoke the sublime in ways that seem kind of relevant to what we were doing. So I just read a ton of those books as sort of the background noise for my life for a long time. Also listening to music, and especially soundtracks for movies that are kind of tonally relevant to what you're doing, can be really helpful to kind of like put you into a trance and just like listen, like on Edith Finch, things like Donnie Darko's soundtrack and All Is Lost, and a couple other movies that have already done the work of saying like, what would a piece of music sound like that would evoke these feelings? And that can kind of help you get into that mindset. Also things like changing the background of your PC or Mac or whatever is just a nice way of kind of steeping yourself and your surroundings, and using your own literal environment to help put you into that mindset in the same way that the game will hopefully put players into that mindset. Similarly, like printing things out, like finding reference photos and then just putting them all over wherever you're working is a nice way so that if you're taking your eyes off the screen, you're still like, there's part of your brain that's like in that world a little bit. And the goal here is to come up with kind of like where the project is headed, but not necessarily the destination. You just want like a sense of, collectively, what do we think is an interesting place to be exploring? And I think that's helpful because so much is going to change about the game, and you're going to be wrong about so many things that people won't get angry if it's still, okay, the game's still about the sublime or still about these other things. Yeah, it feels like you actually know what you're doing, even when you don't really, which is great when you're working with a larger team, because people can start to lose faith early on, or really like the whole project. Like every project I've ever been involved in, there are points where the team is like, what are we doing? But it helps to know like, well, actually we're still technically like making a game about the Sublime or these other things, and it feels like there's some continuity there. And then once you have that like overall direction, you can start to back out and come up with some more concrete things. So for us, looking at like how do you evoke the Sublime, one of the things that we found is that it's often in nature. I don't know why that is, but something about being human, it's an experience that people have it in church and cathedrals as well, but it's often something that's associated with like very large spaces and kind of primal elements. So things like the night sky or the beach, or we tried to find stories that could leverage those outdoor spaces. And then for us, looking at like weird fiction, one of the things that's really common in that genre is these like tales within tales, where someone is writing a story and they're very explicit narratives that are not the truth. They're just one person's version of the truth, which is part of this sense of a world that is more bizarre than you can possibly imagine, that you never get access to the truth. And I think that was something that felt really appropriate for our game as well, so we leveraged that. And then when we're trying to make this game about the Sublime, it's not specific enough for people to easily, there's a lot of interpretation there. And what we found was a little easier to do was the feeling of being overwhelmed. That was something where like the audio designer could take that and be like, yes, I know what overwhelmed kind of feels like, and just a little bit more traction there. And then once you internally like have a sense of what this thing is going to be feeling wise, the next challenge before communicating to the player is that you have to communicate it to the team. And everybody on the team, many people on the team will ask for documents. They're like, oh, it'd be great if there was like a game design document that I could read and that would solve all my problems and answer these things. And I mean, it's nice to write that kind of a thing. Like people feel listened to when they've asked for it and you give it to them. But nobody really reads it and nobody really like takes stuff away from it, in my experience. But it does help you to write it, just to like organize it in your own head. What I found works best is to talk to people in the language that they're most familiar with. And unfortunately, everybody on the team is a snowflake that has their own kind of way that they see the world. But broadly speaking, like artists prefer visual forms. So like finding good reference photos can be super helpful for them. Animators would rather have something like a video reference that's moving. Programmers like feature lists. Like how many of these things we're going to have. Is it one? Is it an infinite number? Designers actually like written things a lot, just to sort of, tend to be a little bit more cerebral about their approach to that part of things. Then in terms of communicating to the team, the gold standard is something that is moving. If you can get a prototype or even just like an animation, there's a lot of stuff that becomes clear. It's sort of like an optical illusion. There are a lot of optical illusions, like a trompe l'oeil, that looks like it could be a 3D thing, but as soon as you move the camera or your eye a little bit, it breaks the illusion. And that's kind of what you want for a prototype. You want something that is breaking the illusion and allowing people to see things from multiple vantage points and to imagine a little easier. Unfortunately, it's really hard to make things that move. Like it's a lot easier just to write a document or find a still image, but that's the clearest way of communicating if you can do it. And we'll talk a little bit later about a bunch of different prototyping tips for how to make prototypes quickly. And then also throughout development, it can be difficult to communicate with the rest of the team where the project is going and how it's changed, because things are just changing all of the time in so many ways. After each playtest, like the designers are generally watching the playtests, and so they have a sense of what the problems were that we had originally and why we've made these decisions. But the rest of the team can get a little bit lost sometimes, especially as a lot of very valid decisions get made, but the rest of the team doesn't see the problems that people were struggling with and why we decided to do that. So on our team, some of the ways that we tried to communicate these changes and to keep everybody up to speed was every Friday we would do a show and tell. We would walk around to each person's computer, and then they would talk for a couple minutes and show what they were working on, which for us was like a really simple, regular process for us, and gave also everyone a chance to be proud of what they had been working on. We also did a thing we called dog fooding, which is where everybody would play the game. So it's like eating your own dog food. And it seems silly, but on like commercial teams, certainly, I don't know if this is true on student teams, a lot of people don't play the game. Sometimes the game doesn't run, too. I mean, in their defense, there are stretches where like the game cannot be played, but artists will spend weeks noodling on tiny little details in an environment, but never actually load up the game to play through it. So it helps to force everybody every so often to just like, as a group, take an hour, and everybody spends that hour playing the game and maybe writing some notes, but don't even have to do that, and then meeting afterwards and talking about how you feel about where the game is at right now. I mean, it seems like you wouldn't need to do that, but people just get so focused on all of their own problems that it's really easy to lose sight of the collective thing that you're making. And then also, when you do playtests, getting everybody else on the team to participate in watching it, even if they're not necessarily going to see something that is actionable for them. Like the artists, can get very fussy about like UV texture unwrapping or things that are just like really minute that like watching the playtest is probably not going to be a big deal, but it helps, I think, for team morale as well as just communicate what the game is and how it's evolving. And then lastly, going to shows like PAX or GDC or whatever is a really good way for people to see what real human beings think of your game. Because often when you're playtesting, it'll be with like friends and family and they're not like legit strangers. So yeah, it can be nice to see that side of things. One sort of big overall note that we found was really helpful on Edith Finch was instead of trying to tell a story through like the story and the text and the dialogue and all that, trying to get as much bang out of just where the events take place. So having a story that begins with you as a baby in a bathtub already does like 90% of our work for us. And then everything else just can be a much lighter touch. So wherever you can, trying to create environments that already like make people, and characters that make people curious about what might happen, makes everything else a lot easier. And then in terms of making the actual prototypes, I look at prototypes as a way to kind of get more concrete with these ideas that you have about what might be interesting. Like it's really easy to spend a long time in a room with people on a whiteboard making lists of cool shit. But when you get to the actual prototype, it's kind of like you getting your hands on the clay. And it's a great way for the ideas to kind of talk back to you and to sort of like a microscope or something that you can use to examine the ideas that you thought might be interesting, and is something that you can make progress on, where on a whiteboard you're just kind of like spinning your wheels at some point. Like it stops being useful, but the prototype is also just a very harsh mistress that will tell you when things are not working and you need to go a different way. And at some level, there's this like mystical element of the game begins to tell you what it wants to be, which I think is, like you've made a whole bunch of decisions that have had repercussions that you don't necessarily understand until you start to see the way that things are starting to break down, or that are great, that are like things that you didn't expect would be as interesting but turn out to be cool. So on Edith Finch, two of the things that I feel like wasn't planned on our part, but sort of emerged over time was the way that a lot of our stories ended up being about people getting lost in their own imagination. And I think it's something that comes out of weird fiction a little bit, and it comes out of some of the themes that we were playing with, but it wasn't something we explicitly wanted to make. We just realized that the prototypes that we had that were working the best tended to be kind of about that story, which was also the player's experience. Like when they were playing a game, they wanted to see what was around the corner, even if that meant the person who the story was about was going to be in trouble. There was this kind of interesting dichotomy of like wanting to be safe, but also because it's a game, partly like just wanting to see what's around the corner. So we made stories that kind of spoke to that. And then we had a logistical problem with games usually being about trying to survive. And in our game, that was impossible. Like, you had to die. And so we spent a lot of work trying to make that not feel like they had failed, just to solve that problem of people not feeling like a failure. But we ended up with something that was kind of like the canonical Finchian moment of the situation where part of you knows that you're about to die, but you're still excited about it. And we actually made a number of scenes feel triumphant, which I think is a very unusual, but for our game, like a very satisfying piece that kind of came out of making these prototypes and trying to solve like the nuts and bolts of like, oh yeah, this playtester felt underwhelmed by this. Like, how do we make them feel a little more exalted about it? And it became one of the signature pieces of the game. Okay, so I'll get into just a few like nuts and bolts tips here on prototyping. The first one is I really like 3x5 index cards. So often, especially early on when you're making something, there's just too many ideas. Like, you have so many different ways of doing a thing and things that seem like they could be maybe interesting. And your brain can only hold like the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. So that's a real thing, that you can only have like about like 5 to 8 things in your head at once, and then it's just like the last one gets moved out. But if you can put it into the world, that offloads things from your brain. And if you can make, you can see like these really crude drawings that I did, that actually like engages part of your brain that is really powerful. Like, we have immense visual processing parts of our brain, and by making it a visual problem, you can leverage that. And I think just having a whole bunch of these things on the wall lets part of your brain, like the subconscious part, kind of dream about these things in a way that isn't possible if it's all like locked away. And it also, like, crude as it is, it becomes a thing that you can share with somebody that has a little bit more resonance than just like one more set of lists. So big fan of the 3x5s. And then when you start prototyping, this is kind of an obvious one, but it helps to work in stages from like the easiest tools up to the most complex. So the very last thing we ever do is make a real prototype in the engine, because that's just like a lot of work, even when the engine's pretty good. So the first thing we do is just go on to Flickr and find a bunch of reference photos. And it's amazing when you start getting into like the specifics of anything, like a father-daughter camping trip, say, and like, oh yeah, like if it was 1970, they would have these like cans that weren't like the aluminum cans. They were like the twist, or like the weird like tab things. There's all these like details that exist in the real world that you don't have to make up. Like, you can just find them. And even if it's not a real world game, there's tons of references for things like the way that armor is made or whatever that you can leverage, and that helps you kind of like 3x5 index cards, get that visual part of your brain working for you. And then the next step would be like mood boards, where you have these 2D images, and you can just put a whole bunch of them together and start to see, resize them and figure out like, okay, which of these like feel the most like the game, and start to make this kind of 2D version of that experience. I'm a big fan of 3D animations as well. I mean, 2D animations would work too, but so much of games and interactivity is about the living part of it and how things respond. And if you can make really crude versions of that, like with no code, just animating it, it helps you to kind of visualize what it might be like. On Edith Finch, we made the game in Unreal, but we did a lot of crappy prototypes in Unity just because it was faster. So I would encourage you, like, even if you have your game is in Unity, just boot up like a vanilla version of Unity with no like engine code or whatever, just like a sphere, and like get that moving around. Here's an example of like one of our early Unity prototypes for this swing set, just to give you an example of like, it's sort of a human. They've got legs, but this is enough for the rest of the team to be like, oh, that's what you mean. That's terrible. We should do, like there need to be like leaves on those trees, and how are you going to have this perspective? And there's a lot of like questions that other people start to have when they.
This human has no hands.
see that. Yes, right. No, I mean, it's like genuinely, like, you start to wonder, like, do we need hands? Like, well, if we have hands, then should the ropes deform? Should they be ropes? Should they be chains? You know, there's a lot of questions that start coming out of that, which, again, like, anything that moves is much easier for everybody else to understand what potential repercussions might be. And then I'm also a big fan of doing everything by yourself if you can. Even though game development is a collaborative effort, I think the more that you can do, even if it's really crappy, like make your own crappy 3D models and your own crappy 3D animations, like the less you need to rely on anyone else, the easier it is for you to prototype your own ideas and find out what's stupid. Because there are a lot of things that you will immediately realize will not work. And it's much easier for you to do that with some cubes and spheres and whatever on your own time than to find somebody and talk to them and get them to do it for you. So just as a really rough pass, if you can be like a one-person studio, that really, really helps with the prototyping phase. So I'd encourage you to bone up on Maya and After Effects and all these other tools, even just like at a very basic level, so that you can explore things on your own without having to be tethered with someone. Because as soon as you get anyone else involved, things just really slow down at that initial phase where you're just like constantly throwing out ideas and trying stuff. And then there's not enough time to talk about this one, but critically damped springs are amazing. It's just like a piece of math that defines how, if you have like basically like a spring, on one end, like if you stretch it out and then it snaps back like that, but it's a way of tuning like how long it takes, whether it like does this kind of a thing, and it's just like a few numbers that you can tune to adjust how that moves, and they're so simple, but they can be leveraged all over the place. So like in Edith Finch, one of the places that we use it everywhere for gameplay, but like for example, the owl controller, when you're controlling the owl, you turn you yaw left and right, and so when you push the stick, we'd say like, okay, like go to maximum speed, which if you just said like, okay, now maximum speed would feel very jerky, so instead it's a spring. So we say like, okay, here, like we want you to be over at this value, but you're here, then just like spring over, so it's like a gentle like ease in, but then, so okay, so the yaw velocity, and we said, okay, like as your yaw velocity increases, then also add like a little bit of roll. So you get that for free by adding another spring that's attached to that says like, okay, as this velocity is increasing, then like gradually like add a little bit of roll. And then on top of that, gradually add a little bit of pitch. So then you get something where the camera does this like, woo, like graceful swooping just by having a couple of springs attached to each other in the code. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't collapse. Like usually when you do something in gameplay with a lot of like fiddly little numbers, you get to a point where it's untunable. Because you tune something here and it like breaks this other thing and they're also interdependent. But with springs, because they're so simple, it's just like a one-dimensional value, game designers can actually adjust those things. And they can also be used like everywhere, especially for camera stuff. Anywhere where you need like smooth motion. Oh yeah, text animations also use that. So there's just like a beautiful, satisfying, organic feeling. Like it just feels expensive, but it's so cheap. And then the last tip is that music is really, really kind. It's one of the few things that you can add late in development and actually make significant changes. Especially when it's like part of it is like a time issue. Like nobody has the time to do stuff, but then there's also technical requirements at the end as you're about to ship the project. The technical director is like, no more new content. Like we can't like overtip this cart. But the music is like basically free. Usually it's just a streaming thing. So it's something that is really powerful, but then also can come in at the very end and works in a kind of subconscious way that can be very specific. So in a lot of our stories, we had the tone maybe like 80% of the way there, but the music was a way for us to very surgically, musicians are just very good, especially working with a talented composer. You can tell them like, yeah, I want it to be like a little bit more wistful, but a little bit less on the nose, and then it's like, oh, okay, got it. And then the music pushes you that last bit of the way there. And then, so that's like how we make the prototypes. which is very fast and loose. And when we get to that point, we have tons of problems. Like the prototypes suck. I mean, they have potential, but there's a lot of things that are broken. And we take a kind of brute force approach where we just throw it in front of people. And I think it's just a lot faster and it's more fun to have other people playing it and finding a lot of the problems, because it's so much easier usually to spot the problems when other people are experiencing them. Like you can imagine all these kind of problems, but you are the worst judge because you've been watching it from day one and you're so sensitive to like, oh yeah, there's that like 1 frame pitch, you know, but like the player's not looking at that probably. They're probably looking at something completely different. So if you like just general recommendations for playtests, don't listen to what people say, the playtesters. Like a lot of them will say like, oh yeah, here's what's broken, like you should fix that, or like this thing's really boring. And they're just really not aware of themselves, like usually. They are, like they're aware that they're upset, but they haven't been paying attention to what got them there. So like on Edith Finch, for example, we would have players who would have a lot of difficulty in certain areas of the game, like the owl early on was really difficult to catch the rabbits. And so people would have a really hard time with the owl. They would spend like 20 minutes failing at that. And then they would get to the shark sequence and they would hate it. They'd be like, oh, this shark that comes right after the owl, like that was really like slow and boring. And it's like, well, it's only because you were so upset, you know, at this thing that had come before, but they don't necessarily know that. So anyway, ignore what they say, but listen to what they, like how they feel. And in a first-person game, it's great to see like where they're actually moving the camera, because that's a good insight into what they kind of think is going on, what they think is important. You can kind of mind read them a little bit. And then anytime a player repeats something, that's a big red flag for us at least. Like we're not making a puzzle game, but I think in general, like it's when they start repeating something, it's sort of like someone at sea flailing around, like they've given up, and that's usually a really bad thing. And some people are going to fail no matter what, so you can't please all of the people, and it's okay. But hopefully most of them are going to have a decent time by the time the game ships. And we would alternate between doing like small functional tests where one person would play through like a section of the game, and we just look for very specific notes with what we called focus tests, where we would have like 3 to 5 people. And the 3 to 5 people playing the same build of the game is really helpful when you have something that's kind of subjective and you're not sure, like, is this thing too scary or whatever it is, just to get a couple more eyes on it. So alternating between small focus tests and then like larger groups of people is good. And yeah, so like some design issues, like particularly pathing. So if people are confused about which way to go, like left or right, or like those kind of issues are really easy to just throw a bunch of people in front of and then like keep making changes. And a lot of those changes will break other things. So it's like you add a light here and that draws their attention, but then they don't notice this other thing that they're supposed to see. And so there's a lot of back and forth, but it's not very scary. I mean, it's nice that there's so many things that are scary in game development, but those kind of problems are not, because it's just like you turn the crank enough times with playtests and you can fix them. And then playtesting at conferences is, I don't know why more people don't do this, but you've got tons of game developers all in one place for a weekend. And it's really easy to just get a hotel room and then have like 10 people show up. And you can, like we emailed people from the Firewatch team or whatever, like people we didn't know, but we're just like, hey, we're in town. Like, would you come by our hotel room? And everybody pretty much said yes, I think, if they were in town. So that's it's very low cost if you're already in San Francisco or Boston or wherever it is, and you can get a lot of really great senior eyes on the project. And people like to help. So. And then, yeah, in terms of like how we play tested and what we looked at, I was really focused on not making the game frustrating, because I think that, like, by the time, at least for a game like ours, it's not about challenge. When people get frustrated, it just sort of breaks every other part of the game. Like, it doesn't matter how good the sound is or how good the gameplay is. Like, if they're frustrated, they just shut down entirely. So for us, places where we had issues, like with the owl, for example, like one of the things we did later was by over time adjusting the difficulty so that if you don't catch an owl for 30 seconds or whatever, then the radius becomes a little larger and a little larger. And also, sometimes there can be multiple ways that kind of make sense. And where it's possible, it's great to support both of those. So for example, we had a ladder, and it was like in the ground, and you could walk forward. And it kind of made sense to keep pressing forward as if you were like going to go down the ladder. But it also made sense, like on the controller, the thumbsticks. But it also made sense to press down because you're going down the ladder. So we just said, whatever one you're pressing, assume that's like the forward in the ladder space, and then reverse it, if you need to. And so everyone who encountered it was like, oh, it works like I expected it to. But as it turned out, like 50% thought one way and 50% thought the other. And rather than like forcing everybody to do the same thing, we just sort of secretly listened to what they thought was the right way to do it. And then for Edith Finch, there were situations where some people were just really dumb. And it's unfortunate because you don't want to make the game, completely challenge-free to save those few people. But there are times where it helps to almost have like a second path that is available. For example, like in Gregory's story, there's a sequence where you're the frog going in the bathtub, and you need to jump on top of a whale in order to reach something else. And the idea of using a whale as a trampoline is not necessarily obvious to every player. Like most people kind of figure it out or do it by accident because there's not much else going on, but some players just got really stuck there. And so we made a system where if you don't jump on the whale for like 60 seconds or whatever, then like a little string of letters starts like rolling around the whale to draw your attention. And it's the kind of thing where hopefully like the players that don't need that system never see it, but the players that desperately need something like that, like it's there for them. And oh yeah, so the last thing is it's really helpful to be able to make changes up to the very end of the game, because that's when you really know what the changes are that are going to be needed. So in our case, like Edith's VO, I rewrote about half of it at the end in small ways, like just to focus on, like who her mother was and like things that were kind of unclear. Because we had done playtests with almost everything in place, we knew, okay, these are the last things that people are really confused about, and could adjust to fit that. The family tree menu in the game, when you pause the game, you see this collection of the family members and the dates and their relation to each other, was a way that we had problems with like people not remembering who the characters were or how they were connected, or how long they were away from the end of the game, which can be difficult. Like in a book, you never have that problem, and like movies are generally like all about 2 to 3 hours. But games, it's like, I don't know, is it 2 hours? Is it 20 hours? But the family tree, where you can see it get filled in, was a way that we could solve many, many problems with that one implementation. And then in our case also, like the 3D text was a tool that we had in the beginning of the game where like text appears in the world, but we just made more and more improvements to it. And so by the end, it was this like very subtle tool that we could deploy, or not so subtle sometimes, where we would like grab your camera and force you to look at text over there if we really had no other choice, and we needed you to not miss something. But then at the end of the project, have a lot of tools that you just like did not have because you didn't make them yet. So everyone else on the team is generally like of the mindset of like, let's just take what we have and polish it up. But I think there's a lot of value in saying like, actually, like maybe we should keep making these changes as long as we can, because they have such huge improvements in the game. And I think that's everything.